Imagine being born into a world where no one owes you anything. Not safety, not freedom, not even your life. There are no human rights here, no laws that protect you just because you exist, no promises written on paper, no courts to appeal to, no universal rules that say you matter. Only power decides. If you are strong, you might survive. If you are weak, you must submit or disappear. And if someone harms you, there is no concept of injustice. Only the question, who was stronger? Today, we're told human rights are natural, that they are universal, that every person is born with dignity. But for most of human history, that idea would have sounded insane. For thousands of years, people did not ask, "What are my rights?" They asked something far more basic. Who will protect me? Protection came from your family, from your tribe, from a lord, a king, a warlord, a god, and that protection was never free. It could be taken away, it could be denied, it could be turned against you. Before human rights, life was not equal, it was ranked. Your value depended on where you were born, who your parents were, what group you belonged to, whether you were useful or expendable. Some people were protected by power. Most people were controlled by it. Slavery was normal, violence was expected. Cruelty was not a failure of the system, it was the system. And yet, people lived this way for centuries. Empires rose, civilizations flourished, art, philosophy, and religion thrived, all without human rights. So here's the uncomfortable question. If humanity survived so long without rights, why did we suddenly decide we needed them? What existed before protection became universal? What rules governed life when dignity was conditional? And what happens when those protections disappear? Because human rights are not ancient, they are fragile. And they exist for one reason only. We learned what humans do without them. This is a story about the world before protection, about power, hierarchy, and survival. About what life looked like when rights did not exist, and why that world may not be as far away as we think. To understand life before human rights, we first have to remove an idea so familiar we barely notice it anymore, the idea that being human is enough. Today we assume that simply existing grants us protection, that there are lines that cannot be crossed, that no matter who you are, some things are forbidden. But for most of history, there were no such lines. No right to life, no freedom of speech, no protection from torture, no equality before the law, not because people were ignorant, but because the concept itself did not exist. Rights are rules that limit power, and in the ancient world, power did not limit itself. If someone had the strength to harm you, they usually had the right to do so. Justice was not about fairness, it was about order. And order meant obedience. Before human rights, protection was not universal. It was personal. You were safe only if someone stronger decided you were worth protecting. A family, a clan, a patron, a ruler. And that protection came with a price. Loyalty, labor, silence. Disobedience didn't lead to a trial. It led to punishment. There was no concept of abuse of power, because power itself defined what was acceptable. If a ruler killed, it was called authority. If a master punished, it was called discipline. If an empire conquered, it was called destiny. And if you suffered, it was simply your place in the world. This wasn't chaos. It was a system built on hierarchy. Everyone knew their position. Above you were those who commanded. Below you were those you commanded, if you were lucky. Your birth decided almost everything. Your safety, your freedom, your value. Moving between ranks was rare. Questioning the system was dangerous. Because there was no higher law to appeal to, no universal standard, no shared definition of dignity, only tradition, only force, only survival. And yet, people accepted this reality. Not because they were cruel, but because they had no alternative framework. The idea that every human life carried equal value would not emerge for thousands of years. In this world, suffering wasn't injustice, it was normal. Violence wasn't a failure of order, it was how order was maintained. And protection, real protection, was never guaranteed. It could be withdrawn, it could be revoked, it could disappear the moment power changed hands. This is the world that existed before rights, not lawless, but limitless. And to understand how humans lived in it, we need to understand the only thing that truly mattered: power. ACT 2. Power instead of rights. When rights do not exist, something always takes their place. That something is power. Before human rights, safety was not guaranteed by law. It was enforced by strength. If you could defend yourself, you might live. If you couldn't, you learned to submit, or you didn't live long. This is what might makes right truly meant. Not chaos, not madness, but a clear, brutal rule. The strong decide what is allowed. Violence was not seen as failure, it was seen as proof. Proof of authority, proof of dominance, proof that the world was working as intended. A man who could not defend his home was not unlucky, he was weak. And weakness was dangerous. Children learned this early, so did slaves, so did conquered peoples. Strength was safety, and safety had to be earned every day. But raw strength alone was unstable, so power organized itself. It became authority. Kings, warlords, emperors, chiefs. They offered something individuals could not, protection through control. In exchange for obedience, you gained safety. In exchange for loyalty, you were spared. This was the contract. You did not obey because the ruler was just. You obeyed because the ruler was stronger, and protection was always conditional. As long as you paid taxes, as long as you fought when ordered, as long as you stayed silent. Disobedience was not a political act. It was a personal threat. Punishment was not meant to correct behavior. It was meant to be seen. Public executions, mutilations, exile, slavery. These were not excesses of cruelty. They were tools. Tools to remind everyone watching that safety came from submission. Laws did exist in this world, but they did not limit power. They organized it. Laws told you where you stood, what you owed, and what would happen if you crossed the line. But there was no law above the ruler. If a king broke the law did not punish the king. If an emperor killed, it was not murder, it was authority. Justice was not blind. Justice had a face. And that face belonged to whoever ruled. There was no appeal system, no higher court, no universal principle of dignity, only the ruler's will. And if that will changed, your fate changed with it. This is the world before rights. Not lawless, but unlimited. Protection existed, but it was personal, not universal. You were protected because someone chose to protect you. And the moment that choice disappeared, so did you. ACT 3, born into value. Before human rights, your life did not begin equal. It began pre-classified. The moment you were born, the world already knew your worth, not because of your character, not because of your actions, but because of your birth, your family, your gender, your class, your tribe, your land. These weren't descriptions. They were destinies. Some people were born protected, others were born useful, most were born invisible. Imagine a newborn child in ancient times. A noble child, the world bends to ensure their survival. They inherit protection, wealth, status. Even the fear of others shields them. A peasant child, survival is fragile. Their parents' labor determines their safety. Illness, famine, or violence could claim them easily. Protection is conditional, not guaranteed. A slave, from the very first breath, they are considered property. Their life belongs to someone else. Their voice exists only insofar as it serves their master. Dignity is a concept they cannot grasp, because society will never allow it. Women often faced a similar fate. They were not considered full persons with rights of their own. Their protection and value depended entirely on the men they belonged to, fathers, brothers, husbands. Their lives were conditional, their status inherited by association. Children had no legal identity. They were counted as future labor, future soldiers, future property. Childhood was not about growth or learning. It was about becoming useful or surviving long enough to serve others. Even outsiders, foreigners, strangers, the conquered had almost no protection. They were often treated as subhuman. Their value was determined by the conqueror, the merchant, or the local lord. It was not about justice or fairness. It was about use and control. This hierarchy wasn't hidden. It was taught, celebrated, and reinforced everywhere. Stories and myths and literature reinforced it. Heroes were born noble, villains were born low. Religions justified it. Kings ruled because of divine favor. Subjects served because it was their fate. Traditions preserved it. Laws, customs, and daily life all reminded people of their place in the order. Most people didn't ask whether this system was fair. They asked whether they were safe within it. Survival depended on acceptance, not resistance. And moving between these ranks was nearly impossible. A peasant could rarely become a noble, a slave could rarely earn freedom, a woman could rarely step outside the protection of men. Even when it seemed possible, it was often conditional, temporary, or dangerous. The rules of society favored the powerful always. This wasn't oppression as we imagine it today, it was normal life. And the most unsettling part? Most people accepted it, not because they were cruel, not because they were weak, but because no other framework existed. Human dignity, universal equality, these were ideas no one could imagine. They wouldn't exist for thousands of years. Until that imagination arrived, people lived their entire lives knowing that their value had been determined for them before they could even speak. If birth decided your value, then the idea that all humans are equal would have sounded absurd, not offensive, not dangerous, simply absurd, because equality threatened everything. It threatened obedience, it threatened power, it threatened survival. Hierarchy wasn't just social, it was psychological. From childhood, people learned to see themselves as higher or lower in the natural order. A peasant did not dream of becoming a noble. They thought, "This is my place." A slave did not demand freedom. They hoped only for a kinder master. A woman did not demand equality. She hoped only for protection. Even suffering was accepted. It was not evidence of injustice, it was evidence of fate. And questioning the system was not just dangerous politically, it was dangerous morally. To challenge hierarchy was to challenge tradition, family, religion, and the gods themselves. This made cruelty efficient. You didn't need to hate someone to exploit them. You only needed to believe they were meant for it. Think of it. In a world without rights, people normalized what we now call horror. Slavery, child labor, conquest, forced marriages, all were just life. Not because humans were evil, but because no other world had ever been imagined. And until dignity could be imagined for everyone, it could not exist for anyone. Empires, kingdoms, and even small communities function under this assumption. Some people are born with value, others without. Power was not random. It was inherited, reinforced, and internalized. The psychological impact was profound. People accepted inequality as natural. They protected their place in the hierarchy. They obeyed because it was survival, not morality. They suffered because it was expected, not criminal. This is what the world looked like before equality was a principle, before worth was shared, before being human was enough. And in that world, survival depended not on rights, but on who you were, who protected you, and who feared you. The foundations of human dignity, fairness, and justice, ideas we now take for granted, had not yet been imagined. This is the harsh truth of the centuries before human rights. The world did not owe you anything. You did not even exist in law. You existed only in relation to someone else's power. And until that relationship changed, until the idea of universal worth could take root, millions would continue to live and die, knowing that their life had been pre-assigned value. Act. Religion as the first right system. When power has no limits, something always emerges to restrain it. For most of human history, that force was religion, not law, not equality, not human rights, gods. In a world where rulers answered to no one, religion introduced a radical idea. Power itself could be judged. Kings ruled land. Warlords ruled armies. But gods ruled fate. For the first time, authority was no longer absolute. A ruler could still kill, punish, conquer. But now, there was a higher order watching. Religion didn't protect people because they were human. It protected them because they were part of a moral universe. This changed everything. Rules appeared where none had existed. Do not murder without cause. Do not steal from your own. Do not rule unjustly. Do not anger the gods. These were not rights. They were limits. And limits were revolutionary. Cruelty was no longer just strength. It could be sin. Suffering was no longer just fate. It could be wrong. For ordinary people, this mattered deeply. You still had no voice. You still had no equality. You still had no protection guaranteed. But your pain was no longer meaningless. Priests, prophets, and religious law became intermediaries between power and morality. They reminded rulers that authority was granted, not owned. That kings could fall, not just by rebellion, but by divine punishment. Religion didn't remove hierarchy, it sanctified it. Kings ruled because God allowed it. Nobles ruled because order was sacred. The poor obeyed because obedience was holy. Inequality was not challenged, it was justified. And protection was still conditional. Religious morality applied primarily inside the group. Your people mattered, your tribe mattered, your believers mattered, outsiders did not, foreigners, non-believers, the conquered. They existed outside the moral boundary. Religion restrained violence, but only selectively, and religious authority often aligned with political power. Temples needed protection, kings needed legitimacy, each reinforced the other. This created stability but also control. Slavery could be moral, punishment could be sacred, obedience could be demanded in the name of God. Still, something irreversible had happened. For the first time in history, human power was no longer the highest authority. Morality existed beyond force, even if it was uneven, even if it was exclusionary, even if it was enforced imperfectly. Religion did not create human rights, but it introduced the idea that power must answer to something, and once that idea existed, it could not be erased. It waited, through empires, through wars, through collapse, until humans asked a question that religion never fully answered. What if dignity doesn't come from gods, or kings, or tradition, but from being human itself? That question would change the world. Act 5. Why human rights finally appeared. Human rights did not appear because humanity became wiser. They appeared because the old world collapsed under its own power. For thousands of years, society survived without universal rights. Power ruled. Religion restrained it, sometimes. Hierarchy organized life. It was brutal, but stable. Then, humanity changed faster than its moral systems could adapt. Industrialization transformed power into scale. Strength was no longer physical. Authority was no longer personal. Violence no longer required proximity. A single decision could now affect millions. Factories trained obedience. Bureaucracies removed responsibility. Technology multiplied consequences. Cruelty no longer needed hatred. It needed efficiency. Empires expanded beyond control. Colonial systems treated entire populations as resources. Human beings became numbers, useful, expendable, replaceable. Religion could not restrain this. Moral rules designed for villages and kingdoms collapsed under industrial speed. God spoke in absolutes. Machines acted in seconds. Then came the wars. Not wars between armies, wars between systems. Entire societies mobilized. Entire populations were targeted. Civilians were no longer collateral damage. They were objectives. For the first time in history, humanity witnessed total war. And for the first time, birth itself became lethal. People were exterminated not for crimes, but for identity, their ethnicity, their beliefs, their existence. This was not chaos. It was organized, documented, legal. Genocide did not happen outside the system. It happened through it. That is what shattered the old world. Because if law could be used to justify annihilation, then law alone was not enough. If obedience could excuse murder, then authority itself was dangerous. If morality applied only to insiders, then humanity had no protection from itself. After the destruction, the world faced a truth it could no longer ignore. Nothing in history prevented this from happening again. Not kings, not religion, not tradition, not civilization. Power, left unchecked, had revealed its final form. This is where human rights were born. Not from hope, from fear. Fear of what humans had become capable of. Fear of what would happen next time. Fear that survival itself was no longer guaranteed. For the first time, nations attempted something unnatural. They tried to limit their own power. Not by custom, not by divine command, but by agreement. Human rights were designed as preemptive limits, lines that could not be crossed, even in war, even in crisis, even by governments. The idea was radical. Some things are forbidden, no matter who orders them. Life cannot be erased by policy. Torture cannot be justified by necessity. Extermination cannot be legalized. Human beings are not tools, not problems, not statistics. This was a complete rejection of historical logic. Hierarchy no longer justified suffering. Birth no longer defined value. Obedience no longer erased guilt. Human rights did not claim the world was just. They claimed power must be contained. They were built on distrust. Distrust of leaders, distrust of institutions, distrust of ideology, and most importantly, distrust of ourselves. because history had proven something undeniable. When humans are given unlimited power, they eventually use it. Human rights were not designed to describe reality. They were designed to stand against it. They were a warning written into law. This is what we must never become again. When human rights were written down, the world did not become safe. It became aware. For the first time, humanity created a shared language to describe what must never happen again. Words like genocide, crimes against humanity, torture, persecution. These were not moral opinions anymore. They were definitions, and definitions matter. Because before that, suffering was tragic, but vague. Cruelty was unfortunate, but explainable. Violence was framed as necessity. Now it had names, and once something has a name, it can be accused. Human rights did something subtle but revolutionary. They separated law from power. A government could be legal and still criminal. An order could be lawful and still wrong. For the first time, obedience stopped being a shield. I was following orders was no longer enough. This idea was dangerous, not because it empowered people, but because it limited authority, and authority resists limits. Human rights were never meant to be comfortable. They were meant to be confrontational. They challenged states, they embarrassed governments, they exposed hypocrisy. That is why they were resisted from the beginning. Some nations signed while quietly violating them, others rejected them outright. Many applied them selectively. Human rights were universal in theory, but political in practice. And enforcement was the real problem. Rights require institutions, courts, observers, pressure, consequences. Without them, rights are words, and words cannot stop tanks. This revealed the central weakness of human rights. They depend on cooperation in a world built on competition. They require restraint from systems designed to maximize power. They assume moral agreement in a world divided by ideology. So violations continued. Genocide did not disappear. Torture did not vanish. Oppression did not end. But something important changed. Cruelty could no longer pretend to be innocent. Leaders now had to lie. They hid abuses. They denied evidence. They rebranded violence as security. This was not justice, but it was progress of a different kind, because power now had to explain itself. And explanations can be questioned. Human rights did not stop evil. They made it harder to normalize. They gave victims language. They gave observers standards. They gave history a record. This is why human rights survive despite constant failure, not because they are strong, but because the alternative is silence. Without them, there is no universal line, only borders, only interests, only force. Human rights are not guarantees, they are warnings. They remind every generation of what happens when protection becomes personal again, when dignity becomes conditional again, when obedience becomes moral again. They exist not because humanity is good, but because history proved what happens when humanity is not restrained. And that is the uncomfortable truth. Human rights are fragile because they must be. The moment they become automatic, they stop being defended. They survive only as long as people remember why they were written. Human rights were meant to protect us from the past, but the past has a habit of returning, especially when we stop paying attention. Act 6. Are we really protected today? Human rights exist. They are written, signed, translated, taught. They hang in courtrooms, they appear in speeches. They are cited in textbooks. And yet the question remains, are we actually protected? Because human rights do not protect people automatically. They protect people conditionally. They depend on states, on institutions, on enforcement, on attention. And attention is fragile. Look closely at how protection works today. If you live in a stable country, with functioning courts, with political pressure, with media scrutiny, human rights feel natural, invisible, guaranteed. But remove any one of those layers and protection weakens. Remove all of them and rights vanish entirely. War changes everything. In war, rights are suspended, reinterpreted, or ignored. Civilians become collateral again. Necessity replaces morality. Security replaces dignity. The same language used centuries ago returns. Exceptional circumstances, temporary measures, for the greater good. Borders matter more than people. Citizens matter more than foreigners. Allies matter more than enemies. Some deaths matter more than others. Human rights are universal in theory, but selective in reality. Now look at power. States still control force. Armies still obey orders. Technology has amplified authority once again. Surveillance sees more than any ruler in history ever could. Algorithms classify people silently. Decisions are automated, distant, unaccountable. No one raises a sword. But lives are still shaped, restricted, erased by systems no individual controls. Ask yourself honestly, who enforces human rights when the violator is powerful? Who intervenes when abuse is legal inside a border? Who protects people when violation is disguised as policy? Human rights do not fail loudly. They fail quietly, through delays, through exceptions, through lack of action. And when they fail, the world begins to look familiar again. Protection becomes personal, dignity becomes conditional, obedience becomes safety, just like before. The most uncomfortable truth is this: human rights did not replace power, they sit on top of it. And whenever power feels threatened, rights are the first thing negotiated. This doesn't mean human rights are meaningless. It means they are temporary achievements, not permanent realities. Every generation inherits them and decides whether to keep them. The question is not whether human rights exist. The question is, what happens when they become inconvenient? Human rights don't disappear all at once. They erode, slowly, quietly, legally. No one announces their removal. They are narrowed, redefined, postponed, always temporarily. A crisis appears, a threat is named, fear returns, and suddenly protections feel negotiable. Security must come first. Order must be restored. Exceptions must be made. The language is familiar because it has worked before. Rights are suspended not because they are rejected, but because they are inconvenient. And once suspended, they are rarely fully restored. Look at how quickly categories return: citizen, foreigner, suspect, threat. Protection becomes conditional again, not based on being human, but on usefulness, loyalty, identity. Technology accelerates this process. Decisions once made by people are now made by systems. Algorithms decide risk. Surveillance decides suspicion. Data decides worth. No courtroom, no explanation, no appeal. The absence of violence makes it feel acceptable. No chains, no executions, no visible cruelty. Just access denied, movement restricted, opportunities erased. And because it is efficient, it feels justified. War completes the transformation. In war, rights are reframed as obstacles. Civilians become statistics. Cities become targets. Deaths become necessary. The world does not protest as one. It argues whose fault, whose side, whose responsibility. And while the debate continues, people disappear. Human rights were designed to prevent this, but they require something uncomfortable: restraint when it costs power, consistency when it costs advantage, action when silence is easier. Without that, they become ceremonial, referenced, praised, ignored. History doesn't repeat itself exactly. It adapts. The structures change. The language evolves. The methods become cleaner. But the pattern remains. Protection shifts from universal to personal. Dignity becomes conditional. Obedience becomes survival. This is the danger, not collapse. Familiarity. A world where rights still exist, but only for some. Where cruelty is not celebrated, just justified. Where no one thinks they are doing wrong. That is how it always returns. And that leaves one final truth. Human rights were never meant to protect us automatically. They were meant to warn us. Warn us of what happens when we stop defending them. Because the world that existed before rights is not gone. It is waiting, quietly, patiently, for the moment we decide they are no longer worth the effort. Final closing. So, are we actually safe? 2 minutes. So here we are. Human rights exist, they're written down, they're taught in school, they're quoted in speeches, but as you've seen, they didn't appear because the world suddenly became kind. They appeared because things went very wrong, and that's the part worth remembering. Human rights aren't magic. They don't protect anyone automatically. They work only when people notice when they're missing. That's why history keeps repeating the same question in different ways. Who gets protected and who doesn't? Sometimes the answer is encouraging. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. And sometimes it's a reminder that progress isn't permanent. The good news, you don't need to be a lawyer, politician, or historian to care about this stuff. You just need to stay curious. That's what this channel is about. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe. More long-form stories like this are coming. If it made you think, leave a comment. I actually read them. And if you know someone who likes deep topics but hates boring lectures, send this their way. Because the past isn't just something we study, it's something we constantly decide whether to repeat or improve. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.